Hello everyone and welcome to CDI's consulting webinar. Today's topic is records management updates you just gotta see. Laserfiche's 10.4 release includes many of the long requested features and benefits of records management in Laserfiche, and we'll be going through those today. My name is Jessica Welsh and I'm the consulting director here at CDI. Today's webinar is going to be good for anybody who's looking to get started with records management, or for those of you who are already using records management and have some perspective on things that you might like to change or features that you might like to implement. So let's go ahead and get started. To kick off, for anybody who's new to records management, we're going to just go through a baseline of what some of the common functionality in managing your records is, and some of the vocabulary so that we're all on the same page that Laserfiche uses in order to set up and manage records within the program. So I've borrowed some slides from Laserfiche because I think they do a really nice job of laying out some of these definitions and the record lifecycle. So we're just going to jump in. So a record goes through a period of being active in every organization. And then it gets cut off, goes into its retention period, that's how long it's kept, before it reaches its final disposition. So let's talk about that a little bit more so that we can all be on the same page of when we talk about a record, where it is, and what we're expecting from that record at any point within the process. So the first part of the record lifecycle is its active period. This is when a record is being created. So this could be drafts, this could be things that are getting routed around for approval before that record is finalized. It could also be an executed record that's just in its active period. So this might be a contract that's approved, and it's active, and it's not in its retention yet. You will know an active record based on your record retention policy, which we'll go through in a little bit here. So after active, a record gets cut off. And so this is the exact point at which a record goes from being active to being in retention. So it ends active and it begins being read-only, we expect, not having any changes, basically like it's in a box in a cabinet, except for this is the digital version. This can be time-based or event-based, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. So once a record is cut off and it's read-only and it's in its archive phase, then it goes into retention. And retention is what we usually think of when we think of records management. How long should this record be kept? Is it permanent? Is it 2 years? Is it 8 years? This is usually something that is decided by your organization's policies or by a governing body or a legislative body that might also be setting the policies for your records. And then the last thing is once that retention period is up, so as long as it's not a permanent record, then there will have to be some sort of final disposition. So Laserfiche provides 2 final dispositions. You can choose to destroy a record, or you can do an accession to an archive location. That might be transferring the file to another agency, or it might be putting it in your organization's own archive and just creating a backup and not keeping it in the main repository area. All right, so those are the 4 phases of records lifecycle. We'll look at how some of this can be automated later in the broadcast here, but it's going to go from active, cutoff, to retention, and then final disposition. So the next thing I want to look at a little bit while we're all together here is how to set up records management, how records management is set up within Laserfiche. So there's a few kind of what we call building blocks or pieces that you put into place that you're able to then deploy when you're defining and entering your records into the Laserfiche client. So we'll look at some of those right now. So the first one we want to talk about is cutoff instructions. So this is the first thing that happens to a record when it's done being active. So a record becomes eligible for cutoff based on one of these types of events. So it could be time-based. That might be something like the end of a calendar year or the end of a fiscal year. A lot of times for accounting records, they might be cut off at the end of a fiscal year plus a month, maybe just to allow for final entry at the end of the year. Then an event-based cutoff might be something like it is cut off, a record is cut off after, maybe if it's a building record, once the building is destroyed, then all of those buildings files become cut off, enter retention for a period of time, and then their final disposition. You might also have a time plus event. So that might be, it's at the end of the year after the building is destroyed. So it might be a couple of different things that go into play. And then the other last four there are things that we do kind of less frequently. We see these less frequently in records management instructions. Intervals, so if it's on a rotating interval of cutoff. You could also do superseded, so if you have, say, emergency management policies that have to stay into place until a new one comes to replace it, then superseded would be the eligibility for cutoff. One can't be put into retention until a new one is available. And then a disposition action can also determine cutoff if it's something immediate. So here's a little kind of definition just for the slides later of all of those more common cutoff instructions. Now let's talk about what are the dispositions. So within Laserfiche, you have the ability to destroy a record. And when you destroy a record through the Laserfiche records management actions, that record can show with the metadata retained. So it will show that it was a record in your repository, but it will have a little cross on it that shows that it's crossed off and it's been destroyed, but you can still see the metadata. And that is optional. The other disposition that you can do is an accession. So this is if you're going to move a record from being under your organization's control to another, then you can export the documents and then you can mark them as having reached that final disposition within your repository. And you can also optionally retain that metadata as well. Both of these final dispositions are recorded in the audit trail. So if you do need to provide a report of records that have been destroyed or transferred, then you would be able to do that at any time upon request. So when a record is eligible for its final disposition, that means it's reached both its cutoff eligibility, so that either that event or time or some other combination of eligibility for being cut off, plus the retention period. So then it becomes eligible for its final disposition. The other things that you can set up within the Laserfiche infrastructure to manage these records are record series and record folders. And these are really the traditional way of managing records within Laserfiche, where you have a file structure made of record series. And the record series, at the point they're right above the documents that they're storing, will have a default retention schedule and cutoff instructions. So anything that's filed underneath a record series will by default inherit those properties automatically just by being placed in the correct record series. These are great when you'd like to organize your records by the type, or if you're able to organize the records in your repository by their retention. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that people have been asking for when you have to store mixed files of different retentions in the same folder, how that might be handled now. In Laserfiche, under a record series is a record folder. And these are used to organize records when they're at the same phase in their life cycle. So everything that should be eligible for cutoff in the same period, or everything that's in its retention, can be in a record folder underneath that record series. The most traditional organization for this is a record folder for every year. That makes it easy to go through and review all of your records that are eligible for destruction or accession to another agency at the end of the year or whenever you do your records management actions. In general, most of the record management actions are performed on a record folder. So speaking of records management actions, now let's talk a little bit about what you do once you get the infrastructure in place in Laserfiche to manage those records. So these are your records management actions. So one thing that you have to do when you're putting records into Laserfiche, whether you're using record folders or whether you're using the new method, is you have to set a filing date. And setting a filing date is basically when that record becomes a file, or a file becomes a record. This is the key date that ties that document or folder, if it's a record folder, to its retention. So the filing date will affect the time and interval cutoff eligibility. So if you are scanning in a record, let's say you're going back and you're scanning all your city resolutions for the last 20 years. And if you're scanning them all into record folders by year, when you get to 1998, if you create that record folder, then you have to go in and set that filing date to be 1998 so that Laserfiche Records Management knows that the records contained in that folder are from 1998. So that's a super important feature of records management, and it's something that needs to be done for every folder and record folder or document. The other thing you have to set is the event date. So that's going to be the key event that kicked a record into its cutoff and then therefore its retention time. So this might be expiration of something, this might be destruction of a building, termination of an employee, retirement date, etc. All of those things that in your record retention policy state that a record should be retained for X amount of time after something happens. The event date is the something that happens. So when a record is in retention, or anywhere in its life cycle really, there are times that come up when that record should be kind of paused in its life cycle. This is traditionally in Laserfiche been called a freeze, and it's now being called a hold. And so this is something that makes it so that the record will not be able to be edited or deleted or modified in any way, so that it can't continue through its life cycle until that hold or all holds are released. All right. And then the last one here that we're going to talk about for records management actions is setting a review date. So in Laserfiche, vital records are defined as records that need to be reviewed on a certain cycle. And so if you have a record that is defined in Laserfiche as a vital record, you'll also need to set a review date. So if that's every 2 years or every 5 years or every 10 years, you'll need to set the next time that that record needs to be reviewed so that it's on in the records management plan. All right, so those are the records management actions: filing date, event date, hold, and review date. So let's take a quick look at how this looks from what you might see in a records retention policy and how that translates through the life cycle. All right, so here's an example of performance evaluations. This just might be a spreadsheet that you get from the state or your own internal organization's policy. It's for documents including performance evaluations, contract employees. And the life cycle is you hold until the end of the calendar year after the performance evaluation, then you retain it for 5 years before archiving. All right, so this document is active until there's an event, which is the performance evaluation, plus time, which is the end of the calendar year. So this is an event plus time-based cutoff. So we would enter the filing date and the event date. And then once the event date happens and is entered, it would be kept in retention for 5 years. And the final disposition would be accession or archiving to that archive location. So those are the things that we would set up if we have something that looks like this. We're not going to dive into actually setting up those components because we've done that in a separate webinar, and that hasn't changed overall in the records management. But if you are just starting to kind of parse out what your retention schedule means in Laserfiche, this is just one example. So let's talk about what we came here to see, which is what's new in Laserfiche. So recently Laserfiche released version 10.4, which included several of the very most requested features for records management. So that's what we're going to look at today. One of the things that we've implemented a lot of times is called flexible or transparent records management. And what this allows and has allowed is for people to be able to see records in a way that's appropriate to their role. So if you're used to working with documents that have in a way that is not at all related to their retention times, you would see your records displayed together, whether they had different retentions or whether they all had the same. Whereas if you're a records manager, traditionally you would see records that were all stored based on their retention times. So you would see all performance evaluations together, all application materials together, regardless of which employee they go to. So new in version 10.4, you are able to mix retention times and apply retentions directly to records if you want. So each individual record can have its own retention applied to it automatically. So if you don't want to use inheritance based on record series and record folders, you can now bypass that and go directly onto the record. And we'll show how to do that in a little bit here. The next one is workflow now allows a lot of the records management actions to be automated and applied to records directly from out of the box. I know some people have done workarounds and custom workflow activities to try to automate more of records management, but now there are a lot of options that are available right in the workflow designer. So we'll take a look at some of those today as well. And then the last one we've talked about a little bit already, but document freezes, so that legislative or some other reason that you would need to pause a record within its retention time, they're now rebranded and called holds, which is a little more industry standard. In addition, you can do multiple holds on the same item. It can be now at the same level, so you can have multiple holds at the document level or multiple holds at a folder level. And holds will inherit down and can also be applied explicitly, and we'll see what that looks like. And you can do holds on documents that may or may not be within a record series. So that's been something that's been asked for as well. So we'll look at all of that. So with all of these new features and functionality, a lot of the problems and the questions and the wish lists have gone away. So let's go through each one of these different new functionalities and some of the problems that it solves. All right, so first of all, the filing date isn't accurate. So in Laserfiche, filing date is on a record folder. And so it's a hidden property, kind of, because it's in the records management properties of a record folder. And if you don't go into records management actions, or you don't right-click and display record properties, you're not going to see that date. There was no way to automatically apply this, meaning that if you're ever scanning something for something other than the current year, a lot of times you had to either go and manually change that, or it was just wrong. So now you can do filing dates can be set with a token in workflow. So this is that out of the box workflow activity, and it allows you to set a number of different record properties. And the properties look just like every other workflow activity, so you just rename the activity. You can write a description if you like, and then you just choose the record management action that you want to do from the drop-down here, and you just say set filing date as this one, and then you can choose a token from your regular token editor. In this case, I'm using the retrieve HR field values activity that I also had in my workflow, and I'm using the effective date of the document that I am running through this workflow to set the filing date. So if this is a calendar-based activity and I go through and I index my document, it doesn't matter which year I'm scanning for, workflow will make sure that that filing date is set correctly so that it goes into records management into the correct year and gets the correct retention and cutoff eligibility applied. All right, so that's the filing date setting. Another issue that we had with records management previously is that organization of your records wasn't intuitive unless you're a records manager. The reason for this is there was no other option in Laserfiche before other than setting up record series with the retention times and the cutoff instructions, and then filing documents underneath those record series. Anybody who's worked in a government agency knows that, HR files then can be comprised of 10 or more different retention times, right? So every employee file would then be split up in between 10 or more different records retention folders. Our workaround was always TRM, but now if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to have that separating everything out by its record series, you can apply retention times directly to documents, and they can just be in a regular folder as opposed to a record series. So let's take a look at what this looks like. This wasn't previously available, so this is very new. But what you can see is I have a normal just Laserfiche folder. I have 3 different documents, and then I'm just displaying in the screenshot the retention schedule column. And so this is pulling and making visible what the retention time is that's set for each of these records. So these can be set by workflow, which we'll look at in a minute, or they can still be set manually if needed. But they're set directly on the record as opposed to on the folder above it and being inherited. So as part of the workaround for that being forced to put everything into its own record series, we had a duplication of views. So previously, or in one of the standard applications of Laserfiche, we would create shortcuts and implement a strategy called TRM, or Transparent Records Management, to get those more intuitive views into Laserfiche. So what this would require is, on one side for records management, you would have all of your files stored under their record series and record folders. But then you would route a shortcut into what we called a document manager view, so that you'd be able to see all the files with their mixed retentions in a way that makes sense to most document users. This did require tunneling security so that you would only have access to the view that you need and not the view that, not both. You don't want to see both, both things. It's kind of confusing. So instead of that, now your original records, if you would like, can be organized as they're needed by document users, and you don't need shortcuts. So you can just have all of the originals mixed, but have their retention times on each document so that they're still able to be managed using the records management searches or reporting. Another issue that we had previously is setting the manual event date cutoff. So within Laserfiche, in order to cut off event-based documents, you would have to go in and manually enter or try to group enter the cutoff dates. And this can be quite extensive amount of work if you have a lot of event-based cutoffs, which most of our cities do have mainly event-based cutoffs. Filing dates had to be manually corrected, and then cutoff might happen late or never just because of the overhead of having to go in and manually set those dates for cutoff. Now, workflow can assign those cutoff dates and cut off the record, both, automatically. This is something that could be scheduled daily, so your records could be cut off, right? That's the piece that puts them into read-only, kind of protects them from user interaction during their retention time. So they could be cut off by a workflow every day, or it could check yearly, depending on what you'd like, or you could tailor it based on the cutoff instructions. But it can do the cutoff for you. So this is going to be a huge benefit to anybody whose job it is to go in and set those cutoffs so that the retention times start and the records management stays up to date. So your workflow at its very most basic would look something like you retrieve the field values of the document once it's scanned in or on a timed basis. You set the expiration date as the cutoff, right? So this is one of our records management actions in that new workflow activity. And then if you are ready, so if this is being set on the date of expiration, then you can cut it off immediately. So performing that cutoff and entering those records into into their retention time can be done immediately based on another of those activities that just is perform cutoff, as opposed to set the cutoff eligibility date. So it can happen just one after the other, and then it's ready and it's in its retention time. And that's all based off of tokens that the user entered at the time that they input the document. So it's not something that ever has to go back and be redone or even retouched until it reaches its eligibility for its final disposition. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is single freezes and holds was one of the other previous issues. So a lot of times there might be multiple reasons that a record needs to be paused within its retention times. And previously that was called freezes, now it's called holds. And if you have multiple reasons to freeze a document, and then one of those gets removed, there was no real good way to be able to remove only one freeze and leave others. And so now, multiple holds are allowed, and holds can be individually removed and individually added more, and expiration dates can be set as well. And so this is just a window or a little screenshot showing what that looks like. So you can have multiple different hold reasons. This could be more specific if you have more specific. It will say the date that the hold was placed, as well as the due date or anticipated expiration date. If there are any inherited holds, they will be shown here as well. So you can see if it's being held at a higher level, that you'll be able to go up to that level to remove those holds. But if this is on a document itself, you'll be able to add another hold or remove a hold for that document at this level. All right, so we have a ton of new features and functionality that we can use, and a lot of our workflow previous assumptions have been kind of blown out of the water. And so we want to just make sure that we're keeping some things in mind as we think about all the different ways that we can now implement records management, or if you currently have records management, if you want to change some of those things, how you might want to change them. So that's we're gonna talk a little bit about the gotchas, or the things that you should be watching out for. So first one is because we can now automate a lot of the records management, we do need to have a little bit more thought and long-term planning at the outset. And the reason is that if we're trying to automate the application of record series by something other than inheritance, it's going to have to be based on user input of metadata at the very beginning, right? So all of a sudden, those fields that we're collecting as part of the template become a lot more important for records management to succeed. And so we're going to, as part of that, want to make sure that we're auditing all of our records as they're getting input, especially at the beginning, to make sure that we're getting the information that we need right at the outset and that our records management is going to go forward and be successful. If you haven't done this before, City Digital does provide records management as well as repository audits. And one of the things we look at is template and metadata information. So if you haven't looked at your metadata in a while, or if you're considering making changes to your metadata, that might be something to look at to get a good baseline of where you're at with your users inputting metadata, where are some of the areas that you could focus on for changes or improvements to your process if you're looking at making this type of change. Another thing to think about is SQL data sources might be very helpful if you're looking to make records management a lot easier for the document managers, but also be able to automate things behind the scenes. You might want to consider having a mapping table that would take all of the document types that would go into a record series and map those over. And this could be visible through a Laserfiche form, or it could be just visible through a SQL table. And if you're interested in learning more about that, the CDI consultants could certainly kind of talk through some of the options that are available for using SQL to make records management more user-friendly. All right, so let's talk about some tips for success. So we've decided to go ahead and start using some of these new functions. What are some of the things that we need to think about now even more than before? So one is you're really going to want to define what's a record at your organization. If you would like to use the feature where you can apply record series to documents directly, as opposed to from a record series, then you're going to want to make sure that you're really clear with your users and that you have the workflows programmed so that you're capturing the records that you want as records and leaving the records properties off of other types of documents. So you want to make sure those definitions are really clear and that the workflows support that all the way through the life cycle. Then you're going to want to make sure that you organize your repository in a way that really helps you with this automation. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your searches set up for your records managers. You want to make sure that the metadata collects the information that you need in order to facilitate that records management actions later on. And if you need a certain structure, if something is going to make a big difference to either your document viewers or your records managers, that you're providing that to them. Another thing we can do even more now is using workflow to automate and alert you when you have searches that need to be done or records that are eligible for destruction. This is kind of a phase 2 for a lot of our clients that we work with in terms of their records management implementations. But this is another important feature, being able to have workflow prompt you when it's time for those activities. And that could be through an email, that could be through shortcuts being created in your working folder. There's a lot of options depending on what works best for you and your staff. And another thing I can't stress enough is to reach out to the user community if you have questions. A lot of the government agencies and even private organizations that we work with manage their records in a similar way, and consultants don't always have that day-to-day visibility and day-to-day interaction with all of the different record types. So if you can, it's always great to reach out at webinars or user groups if you have a chance to go to those, or the Empower conference is a great chance to see how other people are handling some of the challenges. Records management in a digital format is especially fraught with some of those questions and challenges. So other users are an awesome resource for how to manage those on a day-to-day basis. So for this presentation, here are some of the resources that I used as well as that you can use. Some of the records management screenshots that we had from the slides are from the Empower presentation that's listed here. You can download a full copy that's in a lot more detail from the Laserfiche support site. There's also a lot of great documentation in the Laserfiche current help files, so there's a link to that. And as always, there will be free downloads from this webinar at our CDI client portal, so feel free to go in and check that out within a day or so. And we hope you join us for our next webinar. It's extra, read all the barcodes. It's going to be a build along with quick fields and talking about best practices for implementing barcodes. And we'll build a barcode quick field session together, step by step, so you can see the whole thing. It's going to be April 4th from 1 to 2 CST. So hope you guys can join us for that. And then if you can, take a moment to fill out the survey when you exit this webinar. I would really appreciate it. We love your ideas and your feedback because we are always trying to improve these webinars, make sure that they're delivering good, relevant content and answering all your questions. If you fill out the survey, you will get a chance to win this awesome t-shirt that we'll send to you in the mail. And that concludes our Cities Digital Consulting webinar for this month. Thank you everyone for attending. I will now open it up for questions, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question box in your GoToWebinar panel, and I'll go through them as I see them. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. One is about the previous records management webinar, and it's called Records Management in the Real World, and it goes through more of a step-by-step on how to realistically handle all of the records management actions and manage the large-scale records management actions, as well as each step along the way of the records lifecycle, how to apply the cutoff and how to do the final disposition, etc. And it is available, the downloads are available on our client portal. It's also the webinar, the recorded webinar is available on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and search Cities Digital, you'll be able to go to our channel and see that and as a number of our other webinars if you want to check that out. Another question is, can you apply metadata to a folder? So all the documents inside will be populated with that metadata. So there's a couple of different answers to this question. First, for the records management side, if it's a record folder and it's in either, if the documents are either in a record folder or a record series with a record folder underneath it, they will automatically inherit for sure the records management properties, right? So that's just built into standard records management in Laserfiche. For other metadata, so let's say you have a list of address files and you want the property ID number for every document scanned into a property file to inherit that property ID number. You can do that two ways. One is with a workflow. The other is with a token in that metadata field that you want it to inherit. You can put a token that just says parent, and then it will inherit the parent either name or the parent metadata, depending on, there's a couple of differences. The exact tokens are available in the current help files if you want, or Laserfiche Answers has some good information on that as well. We have another question about final disposition for a record folder. So if you put a record folder into its final disposition, and some of the records had freezes on them, can you move them back to an active state? So in Laserfiche, there's no way to undo a final disposition. You can uncut off a record through the records management menu, records management actions, if you have that record explicitly selected. But you can't undestroy a record. There's no way to undo that part. But if you want us to take a look at it, probably the the CDI support team might be your best resource for trying to access those hold files. All right, so the next question is about accession. So this is when you transfer a record to another agency. So if you want the metadata to still be available after the final disposition, whether it's destroy or accession, then you would just make sure that in that record series that you have set up, that you have the checkbox for retain metadata checked. As long as that's checked, whatever the final disposition is, the metadata and the document name will still be available and still be searchable. All right, and then the next question is about a resource for learning searching. And so I think that we have a number of great resources for searching. It's one of the biggest benefits to using a document management system, and one of the things that's sometimes the hardest to wrap your mind around because it's a big difference from browsing through a folder structure. There are some great resources on our CDI client portal. So there's a search tips and tricks guide in the training documentation. We also have webinars on searching. I think I did last year a webinar just on search tips and tricks. So that's available from the Cities Digital YouTube channel. Another super great resource for learning about basic Laserfiche functionality, including searching, is the Laserfiche video gallery, which is available on their support site. It has a lot of 1 to 2 minute quick videos on specific functionality. So that's great. And the other question is related to that, can you build specific searches for different users? And absolutely you can do that. Searches can be saved in Laserfiche, whether it's an advanced search or a quick search. And there's a couple of different ways that you can distribute that. And we go over this in that webinar on YouTube, the search webinar. But you can, if it's in the web client, you can just share it with another group, and it's just available through the search menus to be able to just share it. If it's in the Laserfiche thick client, then you would have to save the search and then distribute it to other users using the attributes. And that's in the Laserfiche admin console underneath each user. So you can share that with another user by exporting the attributes from the person who saved the search and importing them into the other user that you would like to have access to that search. And that can work for the everyone group or another individual. Another question is about if there's a template setting to auto-populate with the last entered. So being able to apply, basically copy metadata from the last document that you just indexed to the next one. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. One, the way I like to do it, the way I think is the easiest is in the Laserfiche scanning window. If you scan everything together in a big batch, you just apply the metadata at the first document level. Then as you split each document, it just has the same metadata. And then you can just change the one thing that changes from each document. So let's say client statements would be an example. If I have 1,000 client statements that I need to hand separate, I would apply the metadata that says client statements, the date of the statement, the carrier or whatever, and then I would just go through and split each document and choose the right client, for an example. Other than that, you can do the same thing with imported image files. So if you have a big document and you just drag that into Laserfiche, you can apply the metadata and then you can just split those documents out using the thumbnails. Works the same way. There's also a workflow option for copying metadata. So if it's something where it would make sense to just have workflow take care of it at the end, when the documents are all split apart, you might be able to just have workflow look at the originally indexed file and copy it to all the other ones. The next one is, how do you get a report following disposition or accession? The best way to do that is through, I think, through Audit Trail. So you can set up a customized report with the columns that you need, showing the final disposition. You can show, which user initiated the final disposition, which day, which workstation, whatever information you need. And then you can save that as a report in Audit Trail. So you can run the same report every year. And what you would need is, you would need Audit Trail. So anybody who has records management should have Audit Trail. If you don't, it's an important feature to have included. But if you have Rio, Laserfiche Rio, you have advanced Audit Trail, so you have access to all of this information. And if you don't, if you've never run an Audit Trail report, you just need to ask your Laserfiche administrator to grant you access to the Audit Trail reporting service. And it's a web-based service, so you can just log into the website and then run your report, and you can export your contents as a CSV or an export, and then you can store it in Laserfiche. And then the last question is about the 10.4 update. So Laserfiche released version 10.4, which includes all of these updates that we've gone through today at the Empower conference. And so that was in February this year. And we've had some clients do an update to 10.4. We also have a number of clients who are waiting for 10.4.1, just because they're not early adopters. So when you update kind of depends on your organization's tolerance for being an early adopter. All right, we have another question about where you can learn about all of the updates to 10.4. And there are a lot of updates in version 10.4 outside of records management, but these are the ones, I think the biggest ones in records management. But if you want a completely detailed list, I will make sure that the PDF that details those gets put into our client portal folder for this webinar. But there's also a lot of discussion about the updates and Q&A about the updates on the Laserfiche Answers site if you want to see what other people are saying and trying about the 10.4 updates. And then there are tons of technical documentation, if you need any of that, available on the Laserfiche support site. So all of the release notes with updated requirements, system requirements, and that kind of thing are available on the support site. All right, it looks like we don't have any questions, any more questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you everybody who has stuck with us through the Q&A and for coming to this webinar, and please do fill out the survey and let us know what else you might like to see or any feedback that you have. Thanks so much, everybody.